Hi, my name is Martin Purnell, and welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, a weekly podcast for those who go or don't go to church and for those that are disillusioned. This podcast series is to encourage via conversation and not necessarily change your mind prior to listening. You can contact us as well by email, ogc@accessradio.biz, and check out our Facebook page, Off-Grid Christianity. We have our own website as well, offgridchristianity.co.uk. So please enjoy today's guest, who is a professor in the sociology of religion at Queen's University Belfast and a member of the Royal Academy. Our guest is from Maine in the USA, but has lived on the island of Ireland since 1999 and in Belfast, Northern Ireland, since 2006. In fact, in 2014, she ran for Northern Ireland in the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, and in 2022, she won the Belfast City Marathon outright. Meanwhile, in research, she focuses on the role of religion in conflict in places like Zimbabwe, Northern Ireland, plus evangelicalism and the emerging church. In 2015, she won a Distinguished Book Award for her co-authored book, The Deconstructed Church, Understanding Emerging Christianity. Our guest has her own website as well, and her recent research output included Clergy as First Responders, Rethinking Leadership in Religion and Peacebuilding. So, what are the similarities between Zimbabwe and Northern Ireland? And how did the church and leaders respond in the Troubles, and what has she learned from it? It gives me great pleasure to talk to Gladys Ganiel. And Gladys, thank you so much for letting us come down here today and be in your home. That's why it sounds a bit echoey for those that listen at home as well. So thank you very much indeed for that.
No worries.
So for those that don't know where you live, whereabouts do you actually live then?
Belfast.
And you've been over here how long?
I've been in Belfast since 2006. And I lived in Dublin 5 years before that, where I did my master's and PhD.
Well, let's see what else we can find out about you then. The 5 classic questions, or maybe not so classic. Fingers on the buzzers, no conferring. Question number 1, Gladys. If you could invite anybody from history for an evening meal, alive or dead, so that you could ask them questions, who would it be?
Now, can it be more than one person?
As it's you, yes.
Okay. I think I would like to talk to John Wesley. I've always been intrigued by him as a sort of figure in church history. I'm really interested in his sort of energy over many years, because if you look at his life, I mean, it was sort of unbelievable, the schedule he kept up. I mean, in terms of all the travel around England and Ireland and, when he was a missionary in North America, and the writing and the constant preaching, and it's, he just seemed to never stop moving. So I would like to really see how he managed that. And I mean, of course, there are a lot of biographies of Wesley and so on and so forth, and you can get some sort of insight into that by reading it. And I suppose I've read a couple Wesley biographies, and I think I recall that at times he did literally like physically collapse and have to lie in bed for a couple months at a time to recover from his exertions. But in terms of that kind of focus and energy for what he believed his mission to be, I think he'd be quite an interesting person to talk to try to get, to the bottom of that.
Yeah. Well, that's a good answer for a start. Before we move to your second one, you're not the first person to choose John Wesley, so there might be a bit of a fight over that one, but it's a great thing. And the thing I remember most about reading his biography was that he just didn't understand women. I don't know if you picked... Did you pick up on that?
Yeah, well, see, I think the fundamental mistake was he married the wrong woman. Because, I mean, if I remember correctly, I think there was actually a woman that came with him to Ireland on some of the missionary trips who would have been better suited for him.
Yes.
I think her name was Grace.
Yes.
Something or other. But there was she ended up marrying somebody else.
She did.
And that was probably the problem. I think he could have had a life probably with her. They were probably a match, but then the person he ended up marrying, I don't think they were suited at all. And then, of course, I mean, there were sort of letters to other women and stuff that were a bit... I don't know what I'd ask him about his love life. I don't want advice from him on that matter.
The thing, when you read the biography of him and you talk about Grace, who went... He thought, I'll give her a job and she can be a minister in Dublin.
Yes,
so he didn't have any problems with women ministers. But his idea was, I think, behind the scenes, was that if he sent her over to Dublin, he's then got carte blanche to go and see her. Look, John, why didn't you just ask her out? That's all you had to do.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, the thing with him and women as well, I mean, I also obviously think his mother was the real evangelist. I mean, I know his dad was the minister, but wasn't there the stuff his dad went away for a couple of months and the mother started having Bible studies in the house and all the people in the town preferred her Bible studies to his father's preaching?
I forgot about that. That's a really good point. Yeah.
So in terms of his attitude towards women, I mean, a lot of it probably comes, from having a mother who was she obviously was a strong, she had 10 kids, right? A strong character, but also very gifted in terms of ministry, really, I suppose. Yeah.
Oh, well, that's a good choice. Anyway, John Wesley. And your second one then, as you asked so nicely?
Yes, well, I would like to talk to Paula Radcliffe, okay? The
yes.
former world record holder in the marathon. Now, again, she has biographies and such, but as a runner, I obviously read a lot of biographies and memoirs of runners, but they don't ever reveal their real, you know what I mean? They only tell you so much.
Yeah.
In terms of, the experience of the training and how hard it is and a lot of the psychological aspects of it. I mean, you do get insights from these, but like particularly her memoir, I think you could get a bit more out of her. And especially, I also think her experiences of being really the best in the world, and then the disasters at the various Olympics. How do you come back from that? There's been a couple television documentaries where she has discussed that a wee bit.
Okay.
And she seems to have come to terms from it. I don't know that I think her husband may continue to be more upset about it, is the vibe I get from some of the documentaries. He's from here,
Oh, is he?
He is. He's, I think his club was it Ballymena and Antrim or something like that. So he came from that neck of the woods.
Okay.
So we've got a local connection to Paula Radcliffe as well. But I get the feeling that he's more upset about it than she is now. But I can't prove that, obviously. I'm not personal friends of Paula Radcliffe and Gary Locke. But, in terms of, you're the best in the world, you've dominated your event, and to have those sort of disasters at Olympics, how do you
well, I'll tell you what, let me just phone her up now. She says you've only got one question to ask her, though. What would it be?
I think I would ask about how she came back after the, especially the one in Athens, the Olympic marathon in Athens, because she was the big favorite for that, and it was a disaster. I mean, and stuff came out afterwards that she had a bit of an injury. She probably took too many anti-inflammatories that upset the stomach, this, that, and the other thing. A few months later, she won the New York Marathon as well, Still, you would think something like that would, after you retire, does it continue to bother you? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, two good choices. And if you do mention Athens to Paula when she turns up, can you just ask her, please, what's a Grecian urn? And leave it at that. Moving on from a very old joke. Question 2. Who's your favourite biblical character, or your favourite biblical story, or your favourite parable, please, Gladys?
Can I have more than one?
Go on, then.
Okay. So, and for the biblical character, I like Joseph. Not Joseph, Jesus's dad, but Joseph
of Arimathea. He says showing off that I can
not that. No, another Joseph. Joseph who's sold into slavery.
Oh, yes, that Joseph with his coat.
Yes. You look at the story of Joseph in Genesis, right? It's in Genesis. It's a long story. It goes on for chapters and chapters. There's a lot in there. I suppose he has an interesting character arc, because he is a bit of a pain when he's the favorite child, isn't he?
I've had another dream.
Exactly. So you can understand why his brothers,
yeah.
But at the same time, what they did to him was absolutely horrible. And so you sort of look at this kid who was he's probably a teenager when this happens, who goes from being the favorite to, slavery, yet still has some sort of resilience and resources to do his job well, to do what he's supposed to do. He's more injustices inflicted on him, and yet he keeps his head. He doesn't despair. And, when push comes to shove and he has the opportunity to show mercy and forgiveness, he does it, I like him. I think he's a good character.
Yes. Mercy and justice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. So from that one then, you said you wanted to choose something else or someone else?
Yeah. I also like Ruth. Yeah. Whenever she goes back with Naomi, she just does her job, what's expected of her without moaning about it. I admire that.
Yeah, she's very much like me. I never moan.
She seems, to do the right thing without expectation of reward. I mean, obviously in the end there is good fortune or reward or whatever you want to call it. And she is accepted as a foreigner, which is unusual. Any expectation she would have had, I suppose, going back with Naomi would be that she would be possibly rejected because of who she was and where she was from and this, that, and the other thing. And probably the people that Naomi had left, they probably resented Naomi as well for leaving and getting out of there when times are hard, So to go with Naomi to what could have been like not a very nice situation, and then just to kind of get stuck in and do the right thing is to me very admirable.
Yes. Good answer. Have you got any more?
No, that's it.
Okay, good question.
I know because there's like one, so I figure a two is probably the.
Well, no, listen, my old motto, if you don't ask, you don't get. Question 3. Now, you've got a choice here, first of all.
Yeah.
Because you are of a different persuasion. You are from across the pond.
Yeah.
Do you want to be Prime Minister of the UK or President of the USA, first of all?
Oh, you didn't ask about Taoiseach?
I know. Oh, sorry. 3 things then.
Yes, you were in Belfast. You're going to...
Naughty me. 3 things then. Which one are you going to go for?
There's actually, here I am, 2, right? They're related, okay? Because I think both in Ireland and the UK, the policies towards immigration are very unfair. Okay, so like in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, these sort of like, well, they're not concentration camps, but they put them in like these direct provision centres.
Oh, right, okay.
Do you know this?
No,
okay.
I only know about the UK and the hotels that was supposedly put up in.
Yeah. Well, in the Republic, there are some refugees and asylum seekers in hotels as well, but they have like these direct provision centres down south. Be something like an old holiday home caravan park type place.
Yeah.
And it's not an ideal place for people to be, right? It kind of echoes Ireland's history of institutionalizing people that they have a problem with. You know, I'm not saying it's the Magdalen Laundries or the industrial schools, but it's a similar type vibe. You know, just put these people in this camp, basically. And I think that's very unjust. And there needs, there's got to be a better way that immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers can be welcomed into the country, and that kind of camp type vibe is very, very damaging, I think, especially, if they're people over here with kids and that. It's almost like, it's not a prison, but it's almost like a prison, an open air type confinement that's not really fair. I mean, it's a similar thing in the UK. We don't have direct provision centres per se like that, but I don't think we've done a very good job of being hospitable, considering, there's talk of sending them to Rwanda and such. That's not a great example of hospitality.
Thank you for that. And of course, combining the Taoiseach job and the Prime Minister job, I could have said a few years ago, we'll make you president of the EU. That'll go.
I can't do that anymore.
That's out the window as well. Thank you. Good stuff. Question 4. Outside of family events, what has been your most enjoyable day out so far, please?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the Commonwealth Games at the beginning.
No, I did.
But that was good. I mean, it's not, I suppose when you think about Commonwealth Games, you can't say it's like a day. I mean, there was the day where I ran the marathon, but it's really like the whole experience and the build up to it and everything. And, on the day, the race, I had a good race. So, that's kind of what you want at a major championship. So that was good in and of itself that I ran well, but
2 hours 40, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was something like that.
Yeah.
It was something like that. And that was before the supershoes. They've invented shoes now. 2017, they were put on the market that make people faster.
Really?
Yeah, I can talk about that more later if that's of interest. But but so you have to look at times now before the shoes and after the shoes.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh.
That's why Paula Radcliffe's world record got broken because they have these super shoes now.
There must be a pun to do with soul in there.
Yeah. So that was pre-super shoes. So 2:40 on that course on that day was a very good time.
If you had your super shoes, what would you have done it in?
Well, they've done studies of these,
I'm sure.
like scientists, right? And they reckon that it varies on the person.
Right.
But for elite athletes, you can expect maybe a 2 to 5 minute improvement.
No.
And over a marathon. Yeah, it's massive.
Wow.
It's absolutely massive, yeah.
Well, I've tried these new super golf shoes and it was supposed to be far better for me, my swing, my posture and everything else like that.
I don't like the super shoes because I think they're fundamentally unfair. And you may think, well, why is that if everybody has them? And everybody does have them now.
Yeah.
The thing is that, again, some of these studies they show is that some people benefit more from them because they will change your form a wee bit, your foot strike. What they have is they have a carbon fiber plate inside them in a very thick foam.
Yes.
Which helps with propulsion. And the way the plate is, it helps where you plant your foot when you land.
Yeah.
So people, if you were more a heel striker, you get more of a benefit from it. Whereas if you're more midfoot to forefoot striker, you get less of a benefit from it.
Yes.
So the heel strikers probably get more benefit because it pushes them a wee bit to have the form that will naturally be faster. So, I mean, most elite athletes have the mid to forefoot strike anyway. Not all, but most do. So the elites probably benefit less from them than somebody who's running slower.
Yes.
And you would see a lot of the club athletes and recreational athletes do wear these shoes now, which are ridiculously expensive as well. But I don't like that some people benefit more from them. It's like the technology is playing havoc with what might have been a different result. But anyway, Nike created them and they rule athletics, so they're not going to ban them.
Not just yet. It's interesting though, because I've already mentioned golf, but it's like the way the technology has evolved in the golf clubs.
Yeah.
And every so often you see a very good golfer take out a golf club, a driver, let's say, from the 1930s compared to the current one.
Yeah.
So if we go back in time, I mean, I first remember watching Dr. Ron Hill run the marathons in the late 1960s.
In a string vest.
It was a string vest. It was. I suppose he was wearing the equivalent of plimsolls, wasn't he?
Yeah. I mean, up until, like in 2014, the shoes I wore in the Commonwealth Games, they weren't much different from plimsolls because what you wanted was the lightest possible shoe on your foot. I mean, you had very little protection with that, but you could go faster. But then afterwards, your legs are in absolute bits. Now, like I run the marathon in these super shoes, and I mean, I'm sore after, but it's no comparison. Like you recover so much better. Like I said, I fundamentally don't really like them, but at the same time, I'm like, I just ran a marathon and I feel much better.
Well, that's brilliant. And if people are listening saying, what's a plimsoll? Over here, they're known as gutties over here. Daps in Bristol, old-fashioned training shoes, tennis shoes.
Yeah, very thin soles.
Yeah, made out of canvas and stuff. Wow, well, there you go. So, yes, I'd like to know more, but unfortunately...
I can't remember what question I was answering.
It was about your most enjoyable day out.
Oh, yeah, the Commonwealth Games. Yeah.
So that's brilliant. So, question 5 then. What has been your most embarrassing moment to date then, please, Gladys?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask me this. So I thought about it, and it's not really that much I'm embarrassed about. I'm fundamentally quite a boring person. I mean, it's not part of this goes from being an athlete from a young age.
Yeah.
So I was into sport from the time I was young. I played basketball first and then I did distance running. So I suppose I also had a personality that you weren't going to do anything ever too extreme that could be embarrassing.
Yes.
Because, you were very concerned about how that would affect your training the next day or this, that, and the other thing. I suppose I avoided lots of embarrassments that could come with youth because of leading quite a monastic type lifestyle.
Yes.
But I never thought of that as a sacrifice because I really, I didn't really have a desire to do things that were a bit more crazier.
I hear that.
Yeah. I suppose there's little things I've had a lot of students over the years but sometimes you forget their names and you meet them and you're embarrassed because you can't remember the name, this, that, and the other thing. But again, I mean, in the big scheme of life, I mean, it's bad you've forgotten somebody's name, but it's not the worst thing in the world.
No, it isn't.
Either, you know what I mean? So
that's how you dig yourself out as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
As I do quite often, just fishing, throwing a coin in to see what ripples come back. Oh, that's it.
Yeah.
You're my wife. You. Which has actually been an embarrassing moment for somebody else as a guest.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that has happened.
I suppose I have done stupid things in terms of again, this goes back to the athletics, being reckless with your body. Now, maybe you could classify this as embarrassing, but one of the things athletes that compete at elite level do is sort of routinely ignore signals of pain and distress.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Yes, I was trying to qualify for the Olympics in 2012. And this is again before the super shoes, so you don't recover well between marathons, right? I was trying to get the qualifying time. So I ran 3 marathons in the space of 4 months or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
And after the last one, I had destroyed my Achilles and then couldn't run for 6 months. So yeah, maybe that would be it. I mean, again, it's probably an embarrassing thing to do to yourself, this form of self-abuse. But at the same time, there's a bit of craziness when you're in that elite endurance sport and you were trying to make the Olympics.
Well, you keep wanting to push yourself, don't you? That's the thing. So.
Any normal person looking at that would be that's absolutely ridiculous thing to have done.
I think any normal person would say 26.2 miles, I'll drive it.
I was training for the Commonwealth Games there. We had support from the Sports Institute out at Jordanstown and they have physios and sports doctors. And I actually had a wee injury before Commonwealth Games as well that they helped me manage really well. But I remember going into the sports doctor and they were doing a scan of my foot and he's like, well, I know you guys don't do this for your health, so... yeah, that's absolutely right.
That's true, isn't it? Begs the question then, moving into what we're here for, really. What made you, though, want to, from an early age, or maybe not, look into politics and, more importantly, the troubles and everything else within certain countries?
So, growing up, I grew up in Maine. Maine, it's a northern state. It borders Canada. But the religious culture where I grew up is quite conservative evangelical in that part of Maine. But I experienced that as a relatively positive thing. I mean, in some ways, it's all I knew, but it was, my experience of God as mediated through that environment was more positive than negative. And I was leaving high school, I had an athletic scholarship for running, and I went to Providence College in Rhode Island. So that's a Catholic university run by Dominicans, and the running coach is Ray Tracy, who's from Waterford. His brother John Tracy was the silver medalist in the Olympic marathon.
Also on Thunderbirds. Thunderbird 5, John Tracy.
Is that the same guy?
No.
I didn't think so. But John Tracy, the runner, silver medalist, right? And Ray, his brother, also ran internationally for Ireland, was the coach of
Providence. The other John Tracy's a puppet.
I don't know those John Tracys.
You don't know Thunderbirds. No. Oh, anyway, that's my
you didn't know the silver medalist in the marathon, did you?
No.
Anyway, yes. So his brother is the coach there, and he recruited athletes from Ireland. A lot of the team was Irish, both the men and the women. I remember it was 1998, and the World Cross Country was going to be in Belfast. So there were English people on the team as well, English and Irish. So one of the nights at dinner, one of the English guys was, just trying to
show off.
No, not show off.
Okay.
Sorry, I said I do not intend any stereotypes. But he said he was trying to just annoy people a bit, poke. And he said something about the World Cross Country were going to be on home soil because they were in Belfast. Okay, so that did poke people a wee bit.
Yeah.
Right? And then one of the other people sitting at the table said, well, the problem with Northern Ireland is it's all about religion. And up to that point, I had no clue, really. I hadn't really thought about Northern Ireland. But because religion had been a positive experience in my life, that kind of sparked an interest.
Yes.
And I took an Irish history course. I think I was taking it in that year, but it was more ancient Irish history or whatever. But that made me want to study the contemporary period a bit more. So I did then my undergrad dissertation on religion in Ireland. You could do independent research or whatever. So that's how I got interested in it. It was basically that conversation at dinner one night. And then whenever I was time to graduate, I wanted to go to graduate school. So I thought I just would go to Ireland and pursue that particular interest. And I mean, it was easy enough to come to Ireland. I went to Dublin for university, and with my teammates, I had a couple teammates living in Dublin at the time who had graduated as well. So it didn't seem like that big of a deal, really.
Yeah.
Going to California would have been more difficult. Probably would have taken longer because you.
That's true, actually. So I'd like to pick up on something that I think is very interesting about the church leaders. We know a lot now on the news and documentaries on TV, certainly over here in the UK, about the Troubles and what it was all about. But I think one of the things that's forgotten so much is about what the church leaders did, or in this case, very few church leaders, because that's my understanding.
Yeah.
So perhaps you could tell us what you found out in your research as to how big a problem was it that church leaders weren't stepping up to the plate compared to the few that were. What did you find out?
Yeah, so there's been quite a bit of research on this, not just by me. So did John Brewer, who worked at Queen's for a lot of years. He's retired recently, has researched this as well. So basically the main thing is that, as you're saying, like the institutional churches themselves were very cautious during the Troubles. But actually, this is a term John Brewer uses. He talks about mavericks within the churches who were the ones who, kind of critiqued their own tradition for the way it had contributed to sectarianism, or kind of reached out and started initiatives with the other side or whatever.
Yes.
So mavericks, and this term maverick captures the idea that they were on the margins of their institutions and they were a minority. And they were kind of very brave and courageous in doing this, despite the fact that they didn't have a lot of support from their institutions. And I mean, I fundamentally, I suppose, agree with his analysis. At the same time, though, like being a maverick, you also have to answer less to people. If you are somebody at the heart of an institution, even if you have the best of intentions, you have to keep so many people happy, hold so many diverse viewpoints together. It is a lot harder to be in the middle of an institution and be a radical, So people on the margins actually had more freedom and flexibility to make the critiques and to take the courageous steps. So if you look at someone like, now the example of Alec Reid in Clonard Monastery is quite well known. Do you know Alec Reid?
No.
Basically, during the Troubles, Alec Reid set up secret talks between Gerry Adams, representing Sinn Féin / IRA, and first John Hume, who's the leader of the Social Democratic Labour Party. It seems he was sort of asked to do this by Gerry Adams, who is, from roughly the area where Clonard Monastery is located. But it's significant that he is a Redemptorist priest. They're kind of outside of the hierarchy of, they're not outside the hierarchy, but they were different
Yeah,
things.
yeah,
You know
yeah.
what I mean?
No, exactly.
But that position, being a redemptorist, actually gave him more freedom and flexibility to do that sort of thing than maybe a parish priest, I think. Of course, he had to have the will to do it and the willingness. This was a time when everybody said, don't talk to terrorists. But if you look at some of Alec Reid's writings, he didn't write a lot in terms of personal reflection. He actually wrote a lot, probably, of drafts of political documents, right, as he was shuttling papers back and forth between people. But if a few kind of personal things he's written that have been published, he sort of frames this as, what Jesus would have done. You do talk to the person who's using violence, because Jesus would have talked to those people. And then how do you stop violence unless you talk to the people who are being violent as well?
Yeah, yeah.
So like during the Troubles, nobody knew Alec Reid was doing this. It wasn't publicly known, but it's fairly well known now if you study this sort of thing. There's been documentaries about it, this, that, and the other. So there was people like that doing sort of secret mediations. And, even some of the high-level church leaders like Archbishop Robin Eames, he was doing that stuff behind the scenes as well with loyalist paramilitaries and so on and so forth. So it is also untrue to say that the big church leaders weren't doing anything either. If you look closely, it's a lot more complex than that.
For me, what I've seen from talking to people as well is that one of the biggest apathies around for Christians is the fact that they're just seeing people pretend to be a Christian on a Sunday.
Yes.
Saying all the right things in the church. And then from Monday through to Saturday, they go back to their old lives. Whereas my understanding, your understanding, and Christianity is a 7-day thing.
Yeah, yeah.
So if that's the case, why did ministers not step up to the plate with Robin and with Alec and say, let's talk to terrorists 7 days a week? So why was that?
Okay, so there's a lot of reasons for that.
How long have we got?
Okay, so for one thing, I think a lot of the theologies and assumptions within both the Protestant churches here and also the Catholic Church is that that's not really what our job is to do, in terms of seeing like peacemaking as part of a vocation. It's almost a lot just don't see that as part of the package. Now you may be thinking to yourself, well, that's absurd in a place where there has been a conflict that has had a religious dimension. Now, I don't think that the Troubles weren't a religious conflict per se. People weren't fighting about doctrine or whatever. It was about inequality and economics and politics and all that. But religion did structure the conflict for centuries. And like, if you want to call it sectarianism, it created a sectarian system where some people had more privileges than others, and religion contributed to that. And there were theologies that justified that justified power and domination. I don't need to go specifically into all those theologies, but they did exist. And then, there's theology on the Catholic side about, is theology the right word?
Yeah.
But yeah, both sides perceived their brand of Christianity as superior. Okay, maybe that's the best way to put it, and had theological ideas that justified that position. Now, during the Troubles, I think a lot of ministers didn't want to touch that or make those critiques. One, because there was a sense that there was not a widespread realization that this idea of blessed are the peacemakers should apply to us in this situation. There's kind of a blindness to that, and there's a number of reasons for that, I am sure. And then the other thing is, particularly in the middle of conflict, this is what I talk about in that paper you mentioned at the very part of the introduction, Clergy as First Responders.
Yeah.
A lot of them were dealing with people who had just been bereaved or injured or really traumatized by the Troubles. So their main immediate job and task is to take care of those people pastorally. And it may not be helpful for somebody who's, forgive the crudeness here, his leg has been blown off, to be told, within an hour of this, that they should forgive or make peace or whatever. Maybe that's not the best pastoral response. I don't think it is. Do you know what I mean? So whenever your immediate task is providing pastoral care, it is conducting the funerals, it's comforting the bereaved, it's following up visits for years and years and years, it's a big ask to be the radical maverick who steps across and does this, that, and the other peacemaking work. I have a lot of sympathy for people who didn't do that because they were so wound up in that pastoral task. And you could also make an argument that that is a necessary role of religion in a situation of violence, is to provide that space or that context where people who have been bereaved, injured, or traumatized can recover without the pressure to do the radical stuff. At the same time, obviously, I admire the radicals, and I've written a lot about them. I wrote a biography of Father Jerry Reynolds, who was also a priest at Clonard. So he did a bit of work with Alec behind the scenes with some of those secret talks. Alec was a main driver, and Jerry assisted him to a certain extent, but Jerry's thing was more like public ecumenical ministry, and he was very kind of bold in this. So you may or may not know Clonard Monastery had a partnership for years with Fitzroy Presbyterian.
Okay.
And they still do, but in some of the darkest days of the Troubles, as they say, they would have had events and so on and so forth. So, like in the biography of Jerry Reynolds, I write about some of those events. Just to give you a sense of this, so like this would have been probably the mid to late 1980s. Clonard Fitzroy had an event where they had a Catholic bishop and the moderator of the Presbyterian Church speaking in Fitzroy together. And the event had protesters, as stuff like this did in the 80s.
Yeah.
So, protesters inspired by Ian Paisley, really. So there were protesters outside. There was a police presence, right? And there was also protesters inside, which people weren't aware of until the thing got started, right?
Yes.
So the thing gets started and the moderator and the bishop are chatting away. And I guess the moderator speaking, because as soon as the bishop started to speak, apparently one of the protesters who was kind of in the crowd ran up to the front and grabbed the communion table and shouted Antichrist. So this is, this is what it was sort of like to be an ecumenical interchurch peace builder or group during the 80s. And, the people were actually willing to do that and take those risks is also, very impressive. Jerry worked with a Methodist minister as well, Sam Birch, and they had a 3-day event one time up in a place in North Belfast that the Paisley's protesters picketed that like for 24 hours. They were committed opponents, to faith-based peace building and ecumenism and so on and so forth. And it was really important that we had people that was doing that more public stuff. And it was really important that there were the ministers providing the pastoral care as well. I think actually one of the most impressive groups during the Troubles was this organization called Evangelical Contribution on Northern Ireland. So the acronym is ACONI, so that's what they would have been known as by that ACONI acronym. But I mentioned earlier how they were getting, destructive theologies. Yeah. And one of those theologies that was used for centuries, the sort of justified, Protestant power, really, domination, was inspired, by the Calvinist tradition and the covenantal ideas that we're a chosen people, we have a promised land, we have a special relationship with God, and this justifies our position here, really. And the slogan "For God in Ulster" kind of captures that covenant idea. You're probably familiar with that slogan. Sometimes see it still on mural walls. This is that we have a covenant with God. We also have a covenant with our state, Ulster, right? And ACONI sort of grew out of evangelicalism again in the mid 1980s as a critique of Paisleyism and as a critique of the God and Ulster fusion. And what ACONI sort of came on the scene with was this, there was an open letter actually first written to the Belfast Telegraph, I believe signed at that point by Presbyterian ministers only. I don't know that there were other denominations in at that point, but they all came, well, not they all, but people came from other traditions later. And the title of that letter was "For God and His Glory Alone." And basically what the idea is that, the For God and Ulster thing, the fusion of religion and politics, is a form of idolatry. And we're critiquing that now. We think it's wrong. And our priority should be God. And in our context, look around you, that means being peacemakers, right?
When was this? What year?
ACONI, I think it's about 1985, somewhere around there. And they were a fairly big organization for about 15 years and would have created a lot of resources and done training courses. And I suppose a lot of what in the parlance here in Northern Ireland is called single identity work, to try to help people work through the maybe destructive, divisive ideas of their religious tradition, to critique them, and then to have an alternative. So ACONI drew a lot on the work of the Anabaptist tradition, things from John Howard Yoder, the politics of Jesus, that type of approach for, a separation of church and state and a modeling of an alternative peaceful community. And ACONI also would have been really influenced by Stanley Hauerwas, who's an American theologian, Methodist tradition, but he's a pacifist as well as being a Methodist. And one of his main books at the time was called Resident Aliens. And the idea, again, it's this getting away from the Christendom idea of religion being fused with the state. So as a Christian, you're a resident alien here within this polity, right? And your job is basically to model the alternative way of life of a Christian,
I'm glad you said that, because there'll be people listening today. We have quite a few people listening in American places like that saying, well, I'm not really interested in Northern Ireland. It's all very well, Martin, going on about this, but, I'm not really interested. For their benefit, what can they learn from what's happened in history? Because the biggest thing I know about history is that we never learn anything from history. So let's change it. Let's be more positive. What can we learn from the Northern Ireland model of what happened to people wherever they're living in the world today?
Yes. Now, that's an interesting question. So at Queen's University, I teach a course on religion and peace building. It's a master's level course, and it's full of Americans every year. Right?
So you teach them how to make tea for a
Yes, we have lion's tea or berries tea or punjana or something decent.
Brilliant. And Thompson's.
The Americans in that class very clearly begin to see the connections between what happened in Northern Ireland and what is happening currently in the United States in terms of the polarization and the racial polarization in the United States and the theological justifications for it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I granted I do try to teach them this, but I mean, they see it very clearly. Do you know what I mean? The United States sort of, I mean, it's the same. It's a similar historical dynamic in that there was a colonization and a settlement.
Yeah.
And it was justified theologically with even some of the same ideas of a chosen people in a promised land and a city on a hill, and God has given us this land. Particularly in the United States, it's sort of bound up with a tradition of white supremacy, if you want to put it that way, as well. So that racial aspect and theologies that justified white superiority. It's not as maybe overt as it would have been historically, but those ideas haven't gone away. I mean, there's structural racism in the United States, obviously, but there's also bigoted attitudes as well, and continued polarization around racial issues and the best way to cope with them. So, I mean, in terms of what, in that situation where the United States is becoming more polarized, and last time I lived in the United States really was like 1998, and then I went back for a year in between my master's and PhD, and it's a much different place, I feel, in terms of heightened polarization than it was
better or
when
worse?
I lived there. Oh, more polarized. When I was in high school, there were moderates in the Republican Party.
Yeah.
They almost don't exist now. Do you know what I mean? The parties themselves both parties, I think, have gotten, more extreme and less willing to work together in a bipartisan way, so it's at the highest levels of politics, and it's also at, the lowest levels of grassroots. But in terms of getting back to what people can learn from Northern Ireland, I mean, I suppose one of the basic lessons is that thing about never stopping talking. Okay, so like during the Troubles, things were bad, but there was always people doing their wee bit.
Yes.
Whether it was the secret talks or it was the cross community outreach, all that stuff that happens at grassroots level between small groups of decent people who are doing their own little bit to resist the madness. That sort of thing can be done, that never stop talking bit. Then the other thing that I think is really important is this ability to critique your own tradition. So that's basically what Oconee did, and then had an alternative. They drew on another theological tradition basically to critique their, Ulster Protestantism's foundational ideas. They used other theological resources to critique that and have an alternative. And I mean, for Oconee, it was also important because they're evangelicals that it was grounded in scripture. So as they were making that theological critique, there was this constant reference to scripture, because there was that awareness if you're gonna challenge Paisley and his constant references to scripture, you have to also use the Bible to demonstrate that there's an alternative interpretation here. So say within the United States or wherever else it is, that ability to critique the tradition has to come in there somewhere. So, I mean, right now in America, you get the term Christian nationalism used sometimes. But this was a term that wouldn't have been used when I lived in the States, when I was a teenager growing up or whatever. But, and sometimes people qualify it with white Christian nationalism, because generally people that could be sort of classified as a Christian nationalist are racially white, if we want to use those terms. The white Christian nationalist package, would include a lot of the religious ideas that were used to justify support for Donald Trump and so on and so forth. So an ability to critique the way religion is used in that case is probably going to be important as well in the American context.
Got you. You talk about Zimbabwe
Yeah.
as well. If we flew you over there today to Zimbabwe and we had a big auditorium, what would you say to them then?
Well, now it's been a long time since I did research on Zimbabwe. I was last there in 2007.
All right.
So I think I last published something on Zimbabwe in like 2010, but that never stopped me from commenting on it. At that period in my career, I spent a bit of time both in Zimbabwe and South Africa, both contexts, When I was looking at Zimbabwe and South Africa as well, I mean, there's a similar dynamic to some of the things I've looked at in Northern Ireland. And it's those mavericks on the margins of the institutions who were really doing some amazing work in those contexts, and were sort of some of the key activists. Now, when you get to sub-Saharan Africa, religion is pretty important. Not only because people there are just more personally religious anyway. If you do the surveys, people are more willing to say they're Christian and they go to church and this, that, and the other. So there's a higher level of religiosity, but it's also important because in those contexts, churches have resources and they have transnational networks where more resources can be funneled to them. So in contexts where there's like sub-Saharan Africa, where maybe other civil society institutions don't have the same sort of resources that you would get within civic society in Europe, churches are actually really important institutions in terms of having the capacity to help people on a practical level, people who are in poverty and struggling, but also then to train people in terms of civic behaviors and peace work, and so on and so forth. Zimbabwe, there's actually quite a few similarities with Northern Ireland in the sense that the past has not been dealt with very well. Okay. Like South Africa had the big Truth Commission. Now, in recent years, there's been a lot of critiques of the South African Truth Commission because it's not fulfilled its promise in terms of reparations and, the justice that people hoped would come after that big event hasn't come in the expected way. So the South African Truth Commission is usually considered one of the best examples, but as the years have gone by, that's been knocked back a bit. But at least they had a Truth Commission.
It was a start.
Yeah, and it was a cathartic type of event. It was actually very heavily influenced by Christianity because of Desmond Tutu's role as the chair. But Zimbabwe, they kind of had some sort of Truth Commission thing, but it was a government stitch up, basically. And, it didn't really satisfy anybody. So in Zimbabwe, there's a lot of open wounds in the past has not been really dealt with in a great way. Now, Zimbabwe, it was Rhodesia, right?
Yes.
After the war for independence, independence is granted, but with the ethnic groups, the main ethnic group is Shona, the second ethnic group is Ndebele, and there were some overlaps with ethnicity and political divisions between those two ethnic groups. They kind of had separate paramilitary guerrilla fighters during the war for independence, even though they were all fighting the Rhodesians. Not long after independence, there was basically a massacre of Ndebele people called Gugurahandi that was perpetrated by mostly, Shona troops who were trained by North Korean army or something like this. And that Gugurahandi thing has been denied and covered up, but there's still a lot of open wounds from that, and some of those ethnic divisions remain important. The past has not been dealt with adequately in Zimbabwe, and there's, it's a disastrous economic situation. The country, it's been destroyed at a certain level in terms of having the infrastructure where people can have peace, prosperity, and justice. It's big problems, but that fundamental inability to deal with the past is part of the picture. Now, at least here in Northern Ireland, we have no government, but things kind of function in their own wee way, right? It's not Zimbabwe at the current time, but we've not dealt with the past in any sort of adequate way. And the current legacy proposals, if everybody is united in their opposition to them, that tells you they're united in their opposition for different reasons. But that failure to deal with the past is going to continue to haunt us unless we can actually do something constructive. And whether the current legacy proposals can deliver that, I would have my doubts. But key to this, it's the acknowledgement and the recognition of the suffering. So if you're in Zimbabwe and your people were massacred, and this is also important there, they weren't buried properly. If that cannot be officially acknowledged and recognized by the government that this was an injustice, that wound continues to foster. And a lot of people here, victims, feel that their suffering has not been acknowledged or recognized. And at some level, they're right. So we have to come up with some sort of way that there can be that recognition and the admission that what happened was unjust on so many levels. You won't get prosecutions and you won't get justice in that sense, I don't think. But you could get a type of recognition that would be helpful or more helpful than the lack of what we have at the minute.
Thank you. So if we were in Zimbabwe tonight, I think what you're trying to say really is that we need to look more at a church without walls, which was a title of your previous website sort of thing. Tell us more about Church Without Walls and why it's so specific to you.
Yeah, well, I suppose the idea behind that is that what matters is when you leave the church building and go out and do, good in the world, basically. Yeah. What does the Lord require of you but to love mercy and to do justice, etc., Micah, So that's where the church is. It's out there outside the walls of the church buildings. That's kind of what I chose that tagline, I suppose, building a church without walls. So the real building up of the church is when you're not actually literally in a church building.
Yeah, Micah 6 verse 3, isn't it? I remember that from my earlier days when I first became a Christian. We had every Bible study would have a little line for the year.
Yes,
and I'm sure it's Micah 6 verse 3. To walk humbly before your God. That's all I can remember, mine.
Yeah.
That's so true, isn't it? I mean, I think what you're saying also is that if we look at Zimbabwe and Northern Ireland, it is what happens outside a church from Monday to Saturday.
Yeah.
And to start off by owning up and saying, do you know what? The past, let's discuss past, let's get all the pain out.
Yeah.
And see how we can move forward. So if it's as easy as that, why aren't we doing it?
Well, it's not easy.
I was going to say, I was being slightly sarcastic. Because,
not all victims actually want some sort of public forum like the South African Truth Commission, right? Because if you ever watched videos of that, to be fair, a lot of the submissions for that were written, okay? But the ones that were on TV that were chosen for the public hearings, it's this outpouring of emotion, and it's heartrending, and it's painful, and it's a hard go for the people who are telling their story, the people who are hearing what happened to their loved one. It's tough going.
Yes.
And not everybody wants that. They're not going to put themselves through that. So you can't assume that they can't assume that's the type of recognition people want. There's other forms of recognition. It's more like the opportunity to choose how you want to be acknowledged or recognized, and also to have a sense that people in power acknowledge this. So whether that's the government or even some of the churches themselves. So I was involved with a project with the Presbyterian Church. It was kind of sort of a small attempt to do this. It was an initiative of the Presbyterian Church itself. They had this dealing with the past task group. And the idea was, this was in the context of previous proposals for dealing with the past in Northern Ireland, where there'd be some sort of oral history archive where stories would be captured.
Yes.
And the Presbyterian Church thought, well, we want to contribute to that. We want to hear some of the stories of how people within our church family, community, experienced the Troubles. So it was passed through the General Assembly. They do this project. I sort of read about it in a report about the General Assembly. Then I bumped into one of the ministers who was on the task group. I'm like, how are you doing that project? He's like, oh, well, they didn't have a clear plan, right? Yeah. So I got involved then, and we got funding from the Irish government, actually, to hire a postdoc who worked with me. And we did interviews with 122 Presbyterians of their experiences of the Troubles, different categories of people like victims, security forces, first responders in terms of healthcare workers, nurses, people who did the quiet peacemaking work, people who had been affected by loyalist paramilitarism, politicians, range of people. So we collected those stories, and then basically I wrote them up in a book. It's called Considering Grace. And the book itself, it's not an academic book. It's basically just a book of stories. And I say just a book of stories, but the idea in making it a book of stories was that this would be an opportunity for, it's only 122 people, and most of them are anonymous, but it's a type of recognition and acknowledgement of the human suffering, basically. And when we were working on that project, Jamie Johannes was the researcher who was working with me. A few months into it, Reverend Tony Davidson, who chaired the task group, he bumped into somebody down the country somewhere who stopped him and said, I just wanted to thank you I wanted to thank the Presbyterian Church. And he's like, why? And he's like, well, you sent that nice young man down to talk to my mother about what happened during the Troubles. No one had ever asked her about it before. So, in a sense, that's what we were trying to do. And, we didn't, that's not the story of everybody, obviously, who participated in the book, but it gave some acknowledgement from an institution with some power in the lives of those people, that there was a recognition of their experience,
Mm.
So can that type of thing be replicated? It's an open question, I suppose.
Let's make it personal then, in the remaining few minutes we've got before we find out who a Christian hero is. How has that affected you in your faith, looking at the past troubles, looking at the fact that you're an American living in Northern Ireland, and with a very clever brain? How's that affected you?
I suppose one of the things, like, how I was saying earlier, I grew up in a conservative religious subculture. But one of the things I think that was inculcated in me from a young age was that God's given you gifts. You got to figure out what those gifts are, and then it is your responsibility to do your best with that, right? So that, in one way, that sounds really terrifying. On the other hand, it sounds like maybe that's like you could reframe that as more a positive thing, right? That this is your vocation or whatever.
I get that.
Yeah, it's also terrifying. I guess it's both at the same time, right? So I've always had this sense that there's this responsibility to do your best with whatever the task it is that you have to do. And for whatever reason, I've ended up in Belfast, and this is the place and the people that have dedicated most of my life to studying. So I see that as it's like a responsibility, I suppose, and your responsibility is to do your best with that.
No, that's a very good answer. But doesn't it ever sort of cheese you off hearing about all the sadness in the world and that people aren't doing, like the verses you've already quoted, like Jesus, let's be peacemakers, everything else like that. Doesn't that ever sort of cheese you off?
Oh, of course. I mean, it's but if you thought of it like that, it would be, It actually, that reminds me. So I wrote that biography of Jerry Reynolds, and I started it, and he was alive, but he died after a month or two after I'd started. So I interviewed him a few times, and I think it might have even been the last interview I did with him, which was like a week or so before he died. And he was talking about during the secret talks with Alec Reid. There were the secret talks between the politicians and the Irish and British governments. But there's also these secret talks that Jerry and Alex set up with Sinn Féin and IRA people and Protestant clergy. Now, they asked the Protestant clergy to do these talks because they knew no unionist politicians would even contemplate it, right? And they thought Sinn Féin and the IRA should hear unionist Protestant perspectives. So they organized these talks that went on for years. And, in later years, Sinn Féin people have said, that was eye-opening for us. It was helpful, this. So we know that these things were constructive. And I was talking to Jerry that day about those talks, and then he was sort of like, but I don't know if it really accomplished much. And I'm like, are you kidding? Do you know what I mean? So even if somebody like Jerry Reynolds could think that, at that point in his life, of course, and then one of the things he used to write in his diaries, because I had the opportunity and the privilege to look at all his diaries,
wow.
It's stuff about just doing that next little thing every day, no matter how bad it looks, or if the institutions aren't supporting you, or you can see the injustices everywhere. It's just your little thing.
Yeah. Well,
wake up tomorrow and do the next little thing.
I said in the remaining couple of minutes,
yes.
Let's go for it then. As you know, or maybe you don't know, at the end of each podcast, I always ask our guests to talk about their Christian hero.
Yeah.
Someone who is dead, someone who's not in the Bible. So that way then, because they're dead, we can go, all right, we know enough now. There's no stuff we can throw at them subsequently.
Yeah.
So, Gladys Ganiel, who is your Christian hero, please?
See, I've already talked about John Wesley.
But you can go for John Wesley again.
Yeah. I think it probably is. Yeah, and I mean, the other thing I like about John Wesley, I mean, I've talked a wee bit about him as well, but do you know the story of like when he was a kid and he was plucked out of the fire?
No.
Do you not know this story?
No.
Okay, so so the family's all in the house, and I think it's nighttime, and the house catches on fire, and they all run out of the house, and they do the head count, and they realize somebody's missing, right? So it's him. He's still asleep up in one of the bedrooms. So they had to get somebody to come. I don't know. I can't remember if it was climb up a tree or ladder or whatever. But they got him out of the house, out of the window. Do you know what I mean? And sort of after that, his mother, again the mother, she told him he was like a brand plucked from the burning, and that God must have something special for him to do in his life if he had been rescued in this dramatic way from the flames and so on and so forth. I mean, in some ways, I suppose it goes back to the dinner conversation. You would ask him about how the impact of that experience, on his life, probably the trauma of it. Because I think he was pretty young, like 5 or 6, somewhere like that age, the trauma of it. And then the experience of growing up, of having a mother telling him he must have some destiny here.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So, and then how he sort of went about trying to work that out and figure that out.
Well, I wonder what John Wesley, when he does come around for a meal, in the time machine, and I bring forward, you cook him a really nice meal. I wonder what he would think of today and Christianity today. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's always in need of reform, isn't it? I mean, that's fundamentally what he was trying to do. And in his day, it was the established church that was ignoring the poor people, really. I mean, that was probably one of his main fundamental things, the poor people who wouldn't go to church because they didn't have nice clothes. Do you know what I mean? So that's why he went out into the open air and spoke to those people and created the guilds and clubs that lifted those people out of poverty to a certain degree, So he would probably look at our churches and ask, what are we doing that is excluding the people who need us the most? And I'm sure it's a lot.
Yeah. Well, you could take him to Bristol as well, because if you stand on a high hill and you look northeast towards Warmley and Hanham, around there, there's a little green light you can see illuminating all over Bristol. And that green light is to signify this is where John Wesley spoke. And obviously that's where the world's oldest Methodist church still is.
Yeah.
Right in the city centre. Brilliant. Good choice, John Wesley. Thank you very much indeed. And Gladys, thank you so much for your hospitality. And I have to say, congratulations on being an American that knows how to make a decent cup of tea as well. That is really, really high praise indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I was just going to say, one final thing with John Wesley, maybe you could give him as a present some super shoes.
Yeah, do you know what? His father told him when he went off to Oxford that he should go out and run around the field a few times every morning to clear his brain. So I suspect he's a wee runner as well.
Well, there you go. Gladys, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yours.